There's no two ways around it. The Flooded Forest is the best area in all of Monster Hunter. If you want to fight me on that, we can throw hands right now, but we're not going to do that because we're civil people. So let's talk about the Flooded Forest like adults. So the Flooded Forest got its debut in the third generation of Monster Hunter Tri, Portable Third, Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, and now in Rise. It has actually not left the third generation up until this point, and for the most part, it'll be people's first introduction to this particular area, but it's like the best place of all time, so we're going to talk about it. Now, notably, it is a forest, a flooded forest, meaning there's water in here. There's lots of parts in the actual map itself that are actually underwater. There's actually whole sections that are 100% completely underwater. Mind you, they're not very large, which is actually a good thing and also a bad thing, depending on how you look at it, because a lot of people really just can't, deal with underwater combat. But we had a whole video where we talked about underwater combat in Monster Hunter, and I would like to advert your eyes to the above link up that way so you can actually check that out if you actually want to know a little bit more about the underwater combat in Monster Hunter. Nevertheless, see, the Flooded Forest wasn't the first time you actually got your feet wet, but it was a notable location where they emphasized the fact that going underwater and fighting monsters in a natural habitat was going to be a mainstay. There are quite a few monsters in the Flooded Forest that actually make this place their home, and also themselves are Leviathans. Leviathans are monsters who traditionally find themselves at a more advantageous, that's the word, and more advantageous scenario when underwater in their natural habitat. We're talking about the Royal Ludroth, the Gobel, the Leviacris. There we go. I try to say Leviathan and Leviacris at the same time. Finds his home here as well. Naga Hyuga, subspecies, the green Hyuga, Crimson Core Pekka, Great Roggy, Rambros. Quite a few monsters here actually find their home in the Flooded Forest. But it actually is a great mishmash of two different typings. So there are monsters who actually aren't Leviathans who stay here, and there's monsters who are Leviathans that also stay here. So it got a great blend of both water and non-water combat, which is why I believe that even when they made the transition to Portable Third and they took out the underwater combat entirely, it was still a notable place to actually fight in. Same as with Rise. Rise, there is no underwater combat because they're cowards, and they decided to bring back my Flooded Forest because reasons, I suppose. I don't know, they're probably trying to get me in there to play the game. I was going to play it anyway, guys, but thanks for really trying to sweeten the deal for me. Nevertheless, so let's talk about the Leviathans and the underwater that they actually give to us in this locale. So first and foremost, when it comes to Leviathans, the first one you'll run into is going to be the Royal Ludroth. It's actually part of a particular key quest you have to do here, and if anything, he doesn't too much fight underwater, but he was 100% designed to have you be comfortable with your underwater abilities and also fighting on land. He does spend a lot of time on land and a bit of time underwater. His underwater tactics, believe it or not, aren't too elaborate. It's to the point where you can't actually keep up with them. But his on-land things seem to be a bit more varied because you're going to be fighting the majority of monsters on land, so that way they kind of give you, the hunter, a bit more of an advantage when fighting the Royal Ludroth. He isn't too wildly powerful. He isn't very complex. He's quite varied, truth be told. You wouldn't think to him having these suite of attacks and things that he does have, but he definitely gets the point across, allowing you to actually transition between land and water freely like a Leviathan does, so that way you can do a little fisticuff underwater, do a little fisticuff on land. He only goes to a couple of different locations where you fight him underwater to any real extensive nature, and he even sleeps on land. So even when the final chips are down, or on your last couple of restores and whatnot, the game gives the advantage back to the player, you, by having you fight him on land. So it's just to get you introduced to the underwater combat, and also still being applicable with how things actually work on land. Moving over, we now talk about Gobel. Gobel is another Leviathan, however, you must first see him underwater. Now you can fish him out. That's a bit of a throwback to the Plesioth from way back in the yonder days, but for the most part, he's underwater. He has a lot of interesting tricks underwater. He gets his rocks off underwater. He does have some on-land capabilities, mind you, 'cause everything does. They are Leviathans. They are mixed between land and water, if you will, but the Gobel has a lot of interesting things that he usually can only do underwater. He was before Nibblesnarf. So you know how Nibblesnarf has that wind tunnel, sand tunnel if you will? Well, Gobel had that. Gobel had that, but underwater. And a lot of things, now think about it, that Nibblesnarf did do that a lot of people didn't really like, Goble started. So a lot of people actually didn't find the fact that Nibblesnarf hiding under the sand, moving around the terrain and doing as he pleased to be something that they found good. Goble does these things. The difference between Goble and Nibblesnarf in this is that because he's doing it under the sand, underwater, like the what would you call it? The floor of the ocean, I guess. The ocean floor, the lake floor. I think it's a lake. I don't know. Whatever. He's under the sand at the bottom of the water area, but you can hit him out of it. Okay. Whereas Nibblesnarf, you could not. So they throw you a bone. You can actually get him to stop doing that stuff if you want to. But his fight is a bit more technical underwater, but allowing you to traverse the areas that are exclusively underwater locations to his advantage, making sure that you stay on your toes, but allowing you to actually look at the majesty that is this particular location. There's a lot of things and a lot of lush environment in the flooded forest, and fighting the Goble, in my opinion, is the best way to actually see it. So whenever you do this, you'll go to these underwater areas that's completely underwater, and you'll see the foliage just kind of swaying underwater as things sway slowly underwater because buoyancy and all that good stuff. The flooded forest design is amazing, and the Goble allows you to see it in all its beauty because it traverses the more reclusive areas of the flooded forest that is underwater. Now, since we talk about the Leviathans who make their home underwater, let's talk about the guys who make their home on land. So first up, we're gonna have Roggy. Roggy isn't too terrible. He's another great. He's an introduction monster, but for the most part, all you really have to worry about is the poison that him and his little minions tend to throw at you. But what they do for the flooded forest is they add a bit more variety. Now, we talked about Leviathans. He's a bird wyvern technically, and his whole thing is to just run around in the thick of the forest. So usually in the more dense locations you'll find him, because I'm guessing they're trying to use the forest, like the dense floor, to its advantage with the whole ambushing thing. I get it. Granted, to be very fair, in the third generation, we're talking about consoles here, the power itself wasn't truly and earnestly there. So let's just say that when Rise comes out, they actually add a bit more dense, more lush, beautiful foliage into the game, allowing the Great Roggy and his companions to do what they were designed to do intentionally. Same with the Naga, but we'll probably get to Naga in a minute. So moving over, he will go to the smaller, harder to reach locations that you'll find him in. More notably, the again, like the spots that are actually really dense, they really show the beauty of the flooded forest, the forest part to the flooded forest, if you will. And quite honestly, they're some of my favorite places. The number one favorite spot in all of Monster Hunter for me is actually somewhere that's above ground that the Great Roggy himself likes to frequent, because that's kind of his thing. Now, there are the more open areas to this map where he will sometimes go to, but for the most part, he likes to keep himself into the more northern reaches of the area, again, where it's much more packed and much more dense and whatnot. But speaking of the more open areas, the Rambros is a monster who initially makes his home here as well. Now, we all know the Rambros is quite large, huge brute wyvern, and he likes to spin around, throw his body in the air, and come down like all weird. Like, no one expected this big thing to actually move and dance and fly like it does. Granted, it goes to the bigger areas, the more larger areas. The area, for the most part, that everyone notably knows is the area with the pyramid in it that we will finally, be able to go and take a look at come Rise, because Rise is a game that is more open to exploration in the world. If you see it in the world, you can go to it in the world, essentially. So we are going to actually be able to possibly, fingers crossed, see what's up and around that area. But the Rambros makes his home in that one large area. I think Area 2 is what it's called, Area 1, mind you, which is another large area. Just any area that actually has a lot of mass, he will more notably go there. Granted, I think he only goes to 3 areas. He's just a big guy. The areas are more open. He can get his rocks off in those bigger areas. But moving over to the more nimblest stuff, we have Green Hyuga. Now, honestly, Green Hyuga is just like the regular Hyuga. They kind of do their own kind of thing. They pounce around. They're like cats. They like to hide in the bushes and ambush you and so on and so forth. So you can expect the Green Hyuga to do that in the flooded forest. The areas where in which the foliage is quite dense is where it's going to do these things. I mean, that's just what cats do. They like to kind of hide from their prey and then pounce on them, much like, you know, you'd expect them to do. So the Naga is no different. So it makes his home in a lot of the areas that the Roggy likes to hang out as well, because it likes to use the foliage to his advantage. And then there's a couple of places where we'll go out in the open, and it's not really trying to hide in the bushes. I mean, the game's AI isn't necessarily set up that way, but it is set in a particular fashion where you can kind of get the sense, oh yeah, you could totally see this thing being here, type of thing. It's one of the more nimbler monsters in the entire game, as it were, but it's not the only monster who kind of likes to pay homage to the fact that it likes to hide in the bushes. Now, the Crimson Core Pekka, I know this sounds really weird for you guys, but the Crimson Core Pekka is a monster who actually revels in actually having other people fight for it. So it itself isn't necessarily going to be on the front line, so it would like to actually hide or kind of be in the more densely packed areas, if you will, so that way when it does call for assistance, you and 2 other monsters in a really small area doesn't necessarily mesh too damn well. And I feel like it knows it, so it actually likes to call Devil Joe, Pink Raytheon, I think the Rambros as well, depending on if it's high rank or G rank, to assist it and actually smack you upside the head. Now, the Crimson Core Pekka isn't incredibly notable. It's just a monster I kind of want to get pointed across as well, because it does find itself here. And I just wanted to mention it. There's other monsters, of course, like I've mentioned, like the Pink Wraith and whatnot, Devil Joe. They frequent this location, but I don't think that they find themselves at home here. So in short, the Flooded Forest is a varied location. And when it comes down to the actual locales themselves, the areas in which you can fight are actually quite lush and dense, all at the same time beautiful. Like it employs all these feelings. And again, one of the best design areas in all of Monster Hunter, in my opinion. Whether you do or do not like underwater combat, there are places that are not underwater that are just absolutely fantastic. Even the underwater locations themselves are the best underwater locations in all of Monster Hunter. Mind you, there's only like a couple of locations, so it's not like it's the Grand King of a huge empire, but nevertheless, it sets the bar quite high for future installments. Should there ever be any. So with the fact that the Flooded Forest is making a return come Rise, I am super excited to see how they actually implement all that it can actually be in Rise. But for the most part, this is just how I feel about the Flooded Forest. And if anyone's never actually been here, hopefully this has been a relatively decent breakdown for you guys to actually show you what the Flooded Forest itself has to offer, all the different fauna that actually live within it, and the locale itself just being as beautiful as it actually is. And here's me hoping that you guys get to see it in all its glory, and you get to love it as much as I do. With that being said, everyone, it's been your boy. Take care.